really is the realm of Mormon thought. That is the realm in which the space and means to discover a larger and more unified understanding of the religion of the Latter-day Saints, an understanding that is related to the student's present living and thinking. He was very insistent on this issue, that it was one thing to understand doctrine, but it's an entirely other thing to understand how it applies, how it relates to the lived experience in contemporary society that students found themselves in. So religion needs to embrace truth from all sources, and that really is key to its full realization and its purpose in our lives. I think I'll skip ahead just to quickly wrap up here. I mean, he's got some interesting ideas that would be worth talking about at greater length about Revelation, but I'll pass on that for now. The third chapter is in some ways the most provocative, and this is the thing for which he was most known, because he was really Mormonism's greatest humanitarian throughout much of the 20th century. And he believed in what he called social morality, and he insisted that this was the key to keeping the religious life adventurous, but also morally meaningful. And he, again, drew his values from the Old Testament prophets and from the teachings of Jesus, the ethical principles that underlie those teachings. In contemporary life, this is in reference to, in a book called The Unknown Testament, the teachings of Old Testament prophets mean that we can spend less for armaments and more for healthcare, shelter for the homeless, food for the hungry, education, arts, and research. Who would not pray the Lord to hasten the day of fulfillment? Apparently lots of people would, but that's another discussion. He also says we learn mercy by practicing the works of mercy. This means that we visit the widows and others who are lonely, succor the disabled of mind and body, provide work for the unemployed, take an interest in children who need attention, and so on. I mean, you definitely, if you know anything about Lowell Bennion, you know that he took that very literally. And you know, these people were among his friends. He knew them by name, and he insisted that we should be reaching out in that way. He took his aim at the virtues and vices of capitalism. He insisted that the church should stand apart from any economic order and be concerned with justice, freedom, love, and goodwill among citizens. He believed that economic activity of any kind should be motivated by the protection of life, respect for free agency, and the promotion of social justice, which was one reason why he wasn't afraid to take aim at certain professions as unworthy of Latter-day Saints. He also believed in maintaining integrity by being directly involved in producing meaningful goods or in supplying a service of real benefit to other human beings. So he believed in essentially a kind of moral economy, not a free market economy per se. Although he was critical of some of the excesses of socialism, he was equally critical of the excesses of capitalism. And as you know, along with Hugh Nibley, is one of the few voices that was willing to offer that kind of criticism after World War II, in particular. He also, of course, praised the virtues of simplicity and took aim at people who may feel that they should have more than they need. He was not afraid to tell people what the price of their home should be as a maximum. And his point was really that possessions shield us from the distresses of others. And he also believed, of course, in the equality of the races and of gender. And those are the things for what he was most known for. I'll just end with this quick summary of what I think he thinks Mormon thought should be. It should be theology, not apologetics. And it should be a thoughtful faith that is big enough to contain paradox, irony, and tension between different provinces of knowledge, and courageous and loyal enough to hope for the circumscription of all truth. He did not believe that Mormon thought should champion or compartmentalize the importance of spiritual knowledge without an adequate theology about education, secular education, a theology of interpretation of lived experience, and of the various academic disciplines, and of how and why and on what terms the secular is not the enemy. He really insisted that theology could do the work to eradicate past errors and avoid the pitfalls of discriminatory beliefs or practices that deny or block self-realization for others. And he really insisted that we should have an intra-religious discourse that is willing to acknowledge the dangerous tendencies of religious life. That was the thing, again, that I found so remarkable in his manuals, is that it was spelled out very clearly at an elementary level that religious life is not sort of this risk-free venture that we should engage in, but one that we should do thoughtfully. So I think that's about my time. I'll stop there.
Hang on a second, Rosalynde. And if you're okay too, Rosalynde, once we have you unmuted, just stay unmuted if you can.
Okay, is everybody hearing me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yes, thank you. Thank you, George. And George may have to leave us before the Q&A this evening. So we thank him for his time this evening and for the overview that he shared of Lowell Bennion's remarkable corpus of work. Next, we will hear from Kristine Haglund, who has written the book, as it were, on Eugene England. So I'll introduce Kristine here briefly. Kristine Haglund holds degrees in German literature from Harvard and the University of Michigan. She was the editor of Dialogue from 2009 to 2015, and more recently was a series editor for the Maxwell Institute's Brief Theological Introductions to the Book of Mormon. I had the pleasure of working with her on some of those volumes. She has blogged at By Common Consent since its founding and serves on the board of the BCC Press. She is the mother of 3 way above average children, both in beauty of body, soul, and spirit, I can attest, and lives with her husband in St. Louis, Missouri. Lucky me, she is my neighbor now, and I am delighting in the time that we've been able to spend together. So Kristine, please take it away.
Thanks, Rosalynde. I thought I would say, are you hearing me? Okay, good. The little yellow screen didn't jump, and so I wasn't sure. Anyway, I thought I would say a little bit more about the book series and how I think it fits into the broader question of what makes Mormon thought. You could, of course, take 2 approaches to trying to figure out what Mormon thought is. One would be to try and synthesize it all into a single, at least quasi-coherent volume, or 3 or 4 or 10 quasi-coherent volumes. Or you could do it the way that Joe Spencer and Matt Bowman have set out to do, which is by focusing on individual Mormon thinkers. Focusing on individual thinkers is Mormon, particularly because we don't really have a mechanism for adjudicating doctrine. People are always talking about the fluidity and flexibility of Mormon theology. And so doing a deep consideration of individual Mormon thinkers may yield a more coherent notion of what Mormon thought is actually like than trying to synthesize. I thought I would say just a little bit about the format of these books, which you may have intuited from George's chapter divisions, but just so that if you're curious and would like to put these volumes on your library shelf, you'll know what you're likely to get. The format is that they begin with a short biographical sketch. It's probably, at least in my book, it's the shortest chapter, and I think that's the idea, is that we're looking at the biography as a means, as a way in to the thinking and the intellectual contributions. And then there are 3 chapters that people are sort of free to organize as they will. And then each volume will end with a bibliographic essay that points curious readers to more work. I especially appreciate this because the hardest thing about writing a book about a really great writer like Eugene England is that I found myself just constantly wanting to quote him. And in fact, I did do that in my first draft of the book, and it came back from the outside readers saying, you got to shorten these quotations. And I kept thinking, but why? He says it better than I ever will. So anyway, luckily at the end of each volume, there will be a way to find more of the original words of each of these thinkers. I thought I would maybe just read the beginning of mine, since I've already written it. And I think it does sort of get at some of these issues that we're thinking about. One of the questions that comes up in 20th century Mormon thought is how it relates to political thought, especially in America. And my book's title, Eugene England, a Mormon Liberal, sort of announces that it will dive into these questions and into trying to think about what liberal and conservative mean in Mormon terms, because they don't work either the way that they do in American politics or the way that they do in Protestant Christian theology, for instance. So here's the beginning of my book. I'm very proud of my first sentence, so please enjoy it. Eugene England was born in 1933, both ahead of his time and having just missed it. He was ahead of his time because his emphasis on the pragmatic goodness of Mormonism and the possibility of mustering Mormon theological resources in the service of progressive politics might appeal to many contemporary young Mormons. And because the kind of openness and dialogue that he hoped and worked for is very gradually resulting in some changes in the church's bureaucracy. It can also be said that he missed his time. He might have been more at home in the early 20th century Mormonism that was shaped by progressive intellectuals like James Talmage and B.H. Roberts, who both died in the year he was born. The expansive version of Mormonism that appealed to England was being eclipsed even before he began to articulate it for his own generation of Latter-day Saints. England had a childhood typical of Mormons in the first part of the 20th century, and his life unfolded in a pattern that paralleled changes in Mormon life. He left the Mormon homeland in the Intermountain West for missionary service, education, military service, and professional opportunities, then returned, bringing new ideas and working to assimilate them into the faith of his youth. He became an influential teacher at Brigham Young University and a champion of Mormon literature. His writings, especially his personal essays, influenced a generation of thoughtful Mormons, and the academic and literary journal he co-founded, Dialogue, a Journal of Mormon Thought, has been a forum for and a record of Mormon intellectuals grappling with the questions that the encounter with secular modernity pressed upon Mormons in the latter half of the 20th century. England's life and thought are intriguing not only in their own right, but also for what they show about the contours of 20th century Mormonism. From the beginning, Mormon theology was complex and even sometimes self-contradictory. As he confronted the issues of his time, England pulled at various threads from the homespun cloth of Mormon doctrine. Questions about the nature of God, the status of scripture, the relative power of authoritative discourse and personal conscience, the comparative epistemological weight of science and faith, and the role of religious belief in the public sphere were all questions that England tried to address in Mormon terms, even when his answers put him at odds with church authorities and other believers. But he also imported terminology from American cultural and political discourse to discussions of church doctrine and ecclesiology. This too is quintessentially Mormon. The collapse of social, political, and ecclesiastical categories has been a frequently criticized and occasionally celebrated feature of Mormonism. In a speech to the English department faculty at BYU near the end of his life, England began by mentioning two formative experiences that had convinced him of the reality of Jesus Christ's saving mission and of the divine authority of the leaders of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The result of those experiences, he said, was that he became both liberal and conservative. His conviction of and devotion to Jesus opened his mind and heart to causes he categorized as liberal. Quote, equal consumption of world resources, justice for minority or dispossessed people, opposition to all wars. His certainty about the divine authority vested in Mormon prophets and apostles made him conservative, he said, although his definition might not have been quite what his audience expected. He said, a firm conservative confidence in the church and its leaders, as well as the gospel, such that I have never felt any need to avoid difficult issues or to simply accept culturally prescribed boundaries. I have felt able to explore our history without fear, to examine troubling questions of doctrine and church practice, to face squarely the humanness of our leaders. He was conservative in cultural ways too. He enlisted in the ROTC and spent several years in the Air Force. He married young and was devoted to his wife and 6 children. He was registered as a Republican for most of his life, and he was a devout and actively practicing member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints for his entire life. But during his life and after his death, almost everyone has described him as a liberal Mormon. In part, this has to do with the way that American religions aligned themselves politically in the 1970s and 1980s, so that England's political engagement in secular liberal causes was the most salient identifier for other Mormons. But Mormon uses of conservative and liberal means something in religious terms that doesn't neatly map onto American political categories. And Eugene England's life was lived at the temporal and geographical center of the widening cultural divide. Theologically, of course, there has never been any such thing as a Mormon liberal, at least not in the ways that most scholars of Christianity have applied the term. Talmage and Roberts were liberal in a quite narrow sense that had more to do with a general openness to modernity, an approach to religion that valorized the human capacity for reason in understanding the things of God, rather than with the kinds of scriptural criticism and the historicized Jesus that came to be called liberal in other Christian denominations. Mormonism has no doctrine of inerrancy and indeed allows an open canon, with 3 books of scripture in addition to the Bible as standard works. And yet most lay Mormon discourse is grounded in a quite literalist scriptural hermeneutic. There is no Mormon doctrine of infallibility, and yet in practice, extreme deference is accorded to authoritative pronouncements, especially those from the highest level of the church hierarchy, but even to the opinions of local lay leaders. Most importantly, Mormonism has no real mechanism for adjudicating or sanctioning any single theological interpretation, and no seminaries or training programs for its mostly lay clergy, so that what is considered authoritative doctrine varies widely, and Mormons with significantly divergent beliefs may consider themselves perfectly orthodox. Moreover, Mormon scripture valorizes individual intellectual effort as salvific. If a person acquires more knowledge and intelligence in this life through his diligence and obedience than another, he will have so much advantage in the world to come, according to the Doctrine and Covenants. Early Mormonism was optimistic about scientific progress and regarded scientific discovery as similar to religious revelation as a means for human beings to come to understand the mind of God. This emphasis on personal intellectual striving corresponded, perhaps surprisingly, with a consistently conservative ecclesiology characterized by a strong centralized authority. Mormons endured serious conflict with their American neighbors and government in the 19th century, and this conflict was often initiated or intensified by dissent from within. Thus, loyalty and unity became primary organizational and psychological values, if not theological ones. In the Mormon struggle to belong in America, there were never clear demarcations between religious, ideological, and political strife. Institutional hypervigilance could trigger fiercely defensive reactions over apparently minor disagreements. And because there was no ecclesiastical mechanism for adjudicating the fundamental theological questions at issue, doctrinal conflicts became personalized. Occasionally, there were ecclesiastical sanctions for dissenters within the church, but more often disputes over the authority to pronounce doctrine played out in ad hoc silencing or ostracization of people who taught controversial ideas like evolution or higher criticism. However, those ideas were often not officially repudiated, and so the next generation confronted the most difficult questions again, and different ideas dominated different eras. Besides Roberts's and Talmage's deaths, the year of England's birth marks the beginning of J. Reuben Clark's ascent through the central church hierarchy. Clark, an attorney and civil servant with a forceful personality, conservative politics, and religious views that tended toward fundamentalism, was called as a counselor to President Heber Grant in 1933. He was ordained an apostle a year later, and over the nearly 3 decades he served, the quorum increasingly comprised men like Joseph Fielding Smith Jr., Ezra Taft Benson, Mark E. Peterson, and Harold B. Lee, who had more absolutist views of God, more literalist views about scripture, and less friendly attitudes toward science than their predecessors like Roberts, Talmage, and John Whitsoe. Eugene England's life and work tell us a great deal about the ways Mormonism evolved in the mid to late 20th century, because he cherished and championed an optimistic Mormonism that was open to liberalizing ideas from American culture, at the same time as he remained devoted to an institutional Mormonism that was gradually narrowing the range of acceptable beliefs in an attempt to streamline doctrine for a globally expanding church. The simultaneous fact of his twinned, sometimes opposing commitments to his interpretation of Mormon doctrines that impelled him toward political and cultural liberalism, and to the conservative church that he loved and saw as a vehicle for progress, even when it moved haltingly, was the challenging and enlivening tension of his life and thought. And then my chapters are organized around the notion of, well, the titles are The Possibilities and Limits of Dialogue, Essay as Form and Method, and then Atonement and Reconciliation. And I imagine that many of you are familiar with England's thought, and so you will recognize how those themes work in his thinking. And I think that's probably enough for now. We can get into more in the question and answers. Let me just read you my most controversial paragraph, which Patrick Mason has already told me he hopes I'm wrong about, so that you can argue with me about it later. England's retirement and his death marked the end of an era in Mormon intellectual life. He was the last Mormon liberal. He was certainly not the last Latter-day Saint to be drawn to progressive social or political causes, or to wrestle with the dilemmas of authority and obedience presented to individuals in a church that makes strong demands for loyal orthodoxy. But by the time of England's death, it was no longer possible to believe, as England did, that his ideas about the nature of God and the authority of the church were in the mainstream of Mormon belief and teaching. There are many liberal and progressive Mormons in North America now, but they must understand liberal as a qualifier of their Mormonism, an inevitable marker of distance from full acceptance. England's liberalism grew organically from a fully Mormon identity. It was not only, or most importantly, an identification with the American political left, but a kind of Mormonism, open to truth from every source, optimistic about human nature and potential, and confident of the possibility of attaining sanctifying knowledge. England understood Mormon doctrine, particularly the notion that human beings are not created by God, but eternally coexistent with God, as granting humanity a radical freedom from divine coercion. His thought is profitably set in dialogue with the work of theologians like Paul Tillich and Reinhold Niebuhr, and innovative philosophers like William James. But his liberal heritage came not through his own study of these sources, but through Mormon thinkers who had been performing the work of assimilation and adaptation for generations. That includes thinkers like Lowell Bennion, as George was just telling us. Few of the next generation of Mormon scholars grew up in the safe valleys of England's youth, in a largely agrarian Mormon world where fathers prayed over crops and general authorities regularly came to visit. The seamless Mormon consciousness that England retained through all of his experience of dialogue and paradox seems impossible to cultivate in the 21st century. Mormons have scattered, and even the tight-knit clusters of Mormon graduate students in the diaspora have grown to the point that few of those students will be able to return to BYU as professors. Academia has changed. Cutthroat competition for job requires early specialization and the kind of publication record that precludes graduate students and junior faculty from starting journals in fields unrelated to their academic specialties. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has changed too. It has grown from a small regional sect to a worldwide church with 15 times as many members as it claimed when England was born, with a large cadre of middle managers and an increasingly aged quorum of the 12, whose energies are consumed largely by administration. While the ugliness of the 1990s conflicts between Mormon intellectuals and the church's hierarchs is fading from consciousness, it will never again be possible for an earnest Mormon with academic ambitions and liberal political inclinations to believe that her religion, her scholarship, and her activism belong integrally to Mormonism. The aspirational wholeness of England's life, fractured by the evolutionary shifts in the late 20th century church, points to an expansive Mormonism that might have been.
Kristine, we're gonna all need to take a moment here to wipe our eyes after that rather tragic conclusion there. Thank you very much for those remarks. I'll just note, as Jonathan noted in the chat, I think we'll organize the question and answer a little differently than we had thought we would. I'm a little leery to allow spoken questions. So you can be thinking now. I'll just have you type your questions in the chat, and then I will sort through them and pose them verbally to our panel when the time comes. So now I am very happy to introduce our final speaker for the evening, the eminent Michael Austin. Mike is the Executive Vice President for Academic Affairs at the University of Evansville, where he was previously a professor of English. His many books include Rereading Job, Understanding the Ancient World's Greatest Poem, and We Must Not Be Enemies, Restoring America's Civic Tradition. He will be speaking to us tonight about the Mormon novelist Vardis Fisher, the figure whom I personally know the least about. So I am very much looking forward to his remarks. Mike, please take it away.
Well, thank you very much, Rosalynde, and thank you, Kristine and George. I am really looking forward to all of the books in this series. I think it's a great idea, and I think that we're all going to learn a lot over the next few years from this series of books. My book differs from Kristine's and George's in a number of ways, but probably the most significant way is that they both seem to like their subject. You know, they seem, Lowell Bennion and Jean England, as sort of admirable people that they would like to spend time with and get to know. And I pretty much don't like Vardis Fisher. I think that if I ever had met him, we would have come to blows. I think he was an insufferable pedant. He was a rigid doctrinaire, non-believer, and so I'm not writing about somebody that I love and admire. I'm writing about somebody who I think was very important to the development of a certain set of ideas and a certain kind of Mormon literature, and largely this is part of a project that I've been engaged in for the last 25 years, though very much part-time because I've been engaged in a lot of other things for the last 25 years, but a project of reclamation and canon building. The academic study of Mormon literature is in the position that I think was best described by Cole Porter in the introduction to his song, Let's Misbehave, which is, if we want a future, we have to get a past. And by that, I mean, we have to have a tradition, a body of work, a canon, or a body of literature that we can criticize simply by definition, because the academic study of literature is the study of literary traditions and canons and bodies of work. This is not the same as saying that Mormon literature needs a tradition, or Mormon writers need a tradition to work from. Writers work from their own inner lights, and some of them wrestle with traditions and some of them don't. We literary critics are much lesser beings, and we need somebody else's light to spur us on to our best thoughts. So this question of deciding what work in the tradition of American literature and British literature and other national literatures constitutes Mormon literature is sort of a big throat-clearing exercise to having a functional and dynamic discipline of Mormon literary criticism, and that's something that I'm very interested in. I've done most of what I've written about Mormonism for the last 25 years has been devoted to this idea. Most recently, Artis Partial, who is here, hi Artis, and I just republished the early work of Josephine Spencer in a collection. She had, her work had the good grace to be in the public domain, so we could publish it without worrying about copyrights. That's not the case with Vardis Fisher. But Vardis Fisher, and I'm going to try to explain why he was important, but he was, I think, the crucial central figure of the development of what a lot of people in the academic world call Mormon literature in the 20th century. I actually, by the time when I saw the announcement for this series and the call for proposals for this series. I had already actually written 2 chapters about Vardis Fisher, one for an article in Dialogue in 2014, published by Kristine Haglund. Thank you very much, Kristine. And another for a book that has still yet to be finished or published on what a lot of scholars of Mormon literature call the lost generation, but which I am tentatively calling simply 1939 to 1950. But Fisher was crucial at this time, and I am very happy to be following Kristine and to be following the book on Eugene England, because nobody has thought more about or done more to do the kind of reclamation that I'm interested in than Gene England. It was Gene who dragged Maureen Whipple out of obscurity and out of darkness to be republished in 1976, to have the Giant Joshua republished, and he worked with all of these writers of the lost generation. He actually codified the various periods of Mormon literature, which include the lost generation. So he was a crucial figure here, along with a lot of people who were part of the Dialogue founding. Bob Reese, who is here, and hi, Bob. Dick Craycroft, Mary Bradford, Neil Lambert, Ed Geary, Maureen Ursenbach Beecher, and Leonard Arrington. All were very, very involved in the 1960s and 1970s in this process that I'm calling canon building, or creating a tradition, or identifying a tradition. Leonard Arrington was the first person to suggest that Vardis Fisher was the crucial figure for Mormon literature in the 20th century. And he did this in 2 different places, in a paper that he gave at the very first conference of the Association for Mormon Letters in 1976, called The Mormon Heritage of Vardis Fisher, and then again in 1979 with Davis Bitton in his book, The Mormon Experience. In both of these, he calls Vardis Fisher the most important, as recognized by the Academy, Mormon writer of the 20th century. And as soon as he said this, Vardis Fisher's widow, Opal Holmes, kind of went ballistic and took out a big ad in the Salt Lake newspapers and wrote to Spencer W. Kimball and filed lawsuits and demanded that Arrington and the church retract any suggestion of Vardis Fisher being a Mormon, because of course Vardis Fisher wasn't a Mormon, and it was blasphemy to say that he was. He was an atheist, he was a free thinker. He may have been slightly involved with Mormonism in his youth, but he certainly wasn't anything as disreputable as a Mormon writer or a religious writer at all. And that kind of put an end to the Mormon reclamation of Vardis Fisher for the next 15 years or so, because nobody wanted to get sued or had letters written to the church about them. And so this idea of sort of bringing forth Vardis Fisher's works and claiming them as part of the Mormon literary tradition was interrupted. And so I'm kind of trying to jumpstart it again, because I do agree with Arrington, actually, that Fisher was a key literary figure. So who was Vardis Fisher? And that's actually a really good question. And that's the most common question I get when I say that I have written a book about Vardis Fisher, is who is Vardis Fisher, and why in the world should I care? Vardis Fisher was born in 1895 in Annis, Idaho. His father, Joseph Oliver Fisher, and his uncle, Alma Lehi Fisher. I'm stacking the deck so that you can see that there definitely was Mormonism in Fisher's background. They were part of a mission that Brigham Young sent to colonize the Snake River Valley in Idaho. Fisher then grew up as the 2nd generation of this colony. He lived in a house that was 10 miles away from any other human being other than his father and mother, his brother and sister. He was not baptized as a child because there was no church. He did attend a Mormon ward school in Rigby, Idaho, and he attended a ward school when it was finally created in Annis. He attended the ward school there. And then he was baptized at 20 years old and called on a mission to Spain. And he writes about this in one of his autobiographical novels. He decided not to go on his mission. Rather, he went to the University of Utah, and like everyone who goes to the U, became a vile apostate. He did not return to church. He rarely had good things to say in public about the Mormons or any other religion, but he always made it very clear that his heritage was Mormon. He wrote 36 novels, very prolific writer. 9 of them would be what I would call Mormon novels, or novels in which Mormonism or the church or Mormon characters play an important role. So about 1/3 of his literary production has to do with Mormon themes. He is most famous for 2 novels. One of them is called The Children of God. And that was not the first novel about the Mormon migration. There were actually 5 novels in the 1930s before The Children of God, but the most famous novel about the Mormon migration, it was published in it won the Harper Prize, which was at the time the richest publication prize probably in the world. It was $7,500, which equates to about $100,000 today. It was 3 years' salary for Vardis Fisher. It was a publication prize. A novel then was published to glowing reviews in the New York Times, the New York Review of Books. It rose to number 2 on the bestseller list. It would have gone to number 1, except that number 1 at that time was John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath, and it's really hard to be competing against the zeitgeist. So he was nominated for the Pulitzer Prize for it, but of course, that was given to John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath. So had it not been for Grapes of Wrath, probably Children of God would have been an even bigger success. But optioned for a movie, which became Brigham Young Frontiersman, which came out in 1940. The final version has nothing to do with Vardis Fisher, and I explain in the book how Universal optioned it simply to avoid a lawsuit because they already had the script in development. But still, he got another almost $5,000 for that. He used all of that money to buy a house in Idaho, and then he lived the rest of his life writing novels. He also wrote a book called Mountain Man, 1965, which was not very well known when it was published. However, when Robert Redford and Sidney Pollack purchased it and made the movie Jeremiah Johnson from it, it became a bestseller and set his widow, because it was posthumous, but it set his widow up for life and allowed her to do things like sue scholars. So all of this, Vardis Fisher also wrote a whole lot of regional fiction about the Snake River Valley, which he called Antelope Valley. And that's really where his writings begin, because those were not very much bestsellers, but they were very well reviewed, and they were they positioned him in the late 1920s, along with William Faulkner and Thomas Wolfe, who was Fisher's friend, as the premier regional writers of the time. You know, Faulkner and Wolfe were from the South. Fisher was from the Mountain West, and they were sort of a set in the criticism of the time. So he wrote about the region that the Mormons founded, more than about directly Mormon issues. But most of his characters are Mormon, and he's really the vanguard of fiction for what we would call the Mormon culture region. So what I say, the sort of phrasing that I use in the book is that Vardis Fisher was a religious unbeliever, but Mormonism was the religion that he didn't believe in. And much of what he did was a reaction to his Mormon upbringing, which he always resented, but which never seemed to let him go because he kept writing about it for the rest of his life. I'm going to close really quickly here, but the last thing that he did, and for the last 20 years of his life, and the reason that you haven't heard of Vardis Fisher, because in the 20s and 30s, he was actually a big deal. He was seen in the same, he was often spoken about in the same sentences as Hemingway and Steinbeck. He was seen as a major force in regional fiction. He had an editor at Harper's tell him that if he would just keep writing books like Children of God, Western Americana, he could guarantee him about $10,000 a year, which was a lot in 1939. He decided that he didn't want to be a regional writer. He wanted to tell the story of humankind. So he spent the last 20 years of his life writing this huge epic series of novels called The Testament of Man, which begins with cave people. It has a book about the war between the Neanderthals and the Cro-Magnons. He has early, very naturalized stories about the Hebrews, about the Exodus, about Solomon. He has a very naturalized story about Jesus, which presents him as a sort of bumbling, good-natured preacher who everyone calls the Messiah, and he decides to go with it. Ends, of course, with a 980-page autobiography of Vardis Fisher, which is a rewriting of some of the novels that he wrote when he was writing regional fiction. He honestly believed that this was his great contribution to letters. He was finding the soul of humanity. Nobody else thought so, and nobody bought the book, and 4 different publishers dropped him over this. By the time he was finished, he couldn't find anybody to publish it. And so he ended his days in obscurity, brought about by the most productive years of his life as a writer being devoted to this epic series, which he really wasn't up to. So the earlier Vardis Fisher that was recognizably Mormon kind of got buried in the obscurity of this series that did not do very well, but which I argue in the final chapter of the book, which is also the article that Kristine published in Dialogue, which is something where he never mentions Mormonism at all, but writes about things that are recognizably Mormon just beneath the surface in most of the books. So that's the project, and that's Vardis Fisher. And as I say, I think he was important, and I think he was a very good writer. I would not have liked him, and would not recommend him as anybody's example of anything. But coming to grips with Vardis Fisher, and then with Virginia Sorensen and Maureen Whipple and some of the other figures from that time period, I think is what is going to make it possible for there to be a thriving discipline of Mormon literary study. And so that's the work that I'm committed to. The end.
Thank you, Mike. I know a little bit more about Vardis Fisher now. It's all new to me, and I agree with you. This grappling is essential. George, do you have a minute or two? There's a question that's addressed specifically to you, and you've got to leave soon. Do you have a moment? Before you have to?
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll start out just with a really thoughtful question here by John Lyon, who asked about the extent to which both England and Bennion saw themselves as kind of translating and assimilating non-Mormon thinkers for a Mormon audience, or on the contrary, did they see themselves mostly as sort of working from a native internal tradition and doing new work. George, do you want to address that first? What kind of non-Mormon sources were important to Bennion, and did he see himself as part of his work translating those for an LDS audience?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's very hard to answer with Bennion because he didn't include extensive bibliographies in his books, didn't quote a lot of people other than scriptures. He didn't even tend to quote general authorities very often. He was very dedicated to scripture reading. And so, I mean, there's no question, in fact, wrote books about reading scripture. There's no question that he felt that was his sort of ethical responsibility, was to the sacred written word. But and it's hard to say, because as soon as you think, well, Max Weber obviously was a very important thinker in his life, and he studied with great scholars in Europe to get his PhD, and that informed the way he thought about religion. But Milton Bennion, his father, wrote books about ethics that were, sort of that kind. And so it's hard to say that, the chicken or the egg kind of thing, whether he was assimilating one or the other. But his academic potential as a scholar was sort of curtailed by having been tapped by John Widtsoe early as a young man, as a promising intellectual force in the church, to head up the Institute, and he was close with David O. McKay. And so he had, and then he's immediately conscripted to write manuals, so he wasn't even, it's really not until the 1980s or 1970s, 80s, and up until his death in the mid 90s, where he's on his own writing what he called his little short books that he just pumped out during those decades. But for the church, he wrote dozens of manuals. And so he was, I think he's very subtly, actually, whether he's doing it because he's reading other writers, he was very influenced by Albert Schweitzer. He was influenced by a number of theologians that he mentions briefly, but it's not clear. And I'm actually still trying to track this down with his family to see if I can get access to if they've preserved any personal library, because there's so little. Mary Bradford's biography doesn't really include a lot of his sort of intellectual inheritance. So it's kind of hard to trace. But he, and maybe just in reference to the other question that I saw Ben asking, he was, because he was kind of a hired gun for the church and he was close to general authorities, I think he very clearly saw himself as trying, he was very loyal to the church. I think it was a sincere loyalty that he learned from his father. His father was his most important intellectual and spiritual model. There's no question about it. He was enormously influential on Lowell's life, and was immensely proud of Lowell. But he never called out the church or church leaders in a sort of shaming way. He was always trying to work within the tradition. And I think that was, again, partly because that was his employment in the first many decades of his life. He has this famous moment in the at the end of his time at the Institute, where he's kind of nudged out, and he felt that people made more of that than he wanted them to. But he refused, and very similar to what Gene England did, he sort of refused to sort of call out names and say, I've been mistreated and so on. He just went about what he was actually pretty happy to go about doing more humanitarian work at that point in his life. But because of that early employment, I think he just, and his father's example, he felt like he was writing within the tradition and bringing in the best thought from outside, but very cagely using, whether it was his own readings of the scripture or influences from outside, he was definitely using his best thought to reform, almost sort of to inoculate the church. I mean, I think he was trying to prevent the church from running into problems that he was seeing happening. The controversies over evolution and so on, he thought were totally unnecessary and totally unproductive for college students, and he wanted to steer the church away. but he would do it in a way that was in part because he had sort of the keys to the car. He could write the manuals that he felt could shape an ethos and a way of thinking that would avoid a lot of those problems. Once he's no longer in that position, of course, he's getting published all over the place afterwards by everything from, independent publishers to Deseret Book, but he's still trying to do that kind of work, and he's still trying to sound not like this maverick voice, but an institutional voice that is, I think his greatest power is his power of reason. He's just got such extraordinary common sense to his arguments, and he's so lucid and so accessible in his prose, and there's nothing at all about him in his writings. It's never about a kind of personality or a movement or anything. It's just about the purity in his mind of the fundamental principles and values of the gospel. Anyway, that's probably, I hate to depart in the middle of this. This is the only night we could arrange to do it, and I had made a commitment tonight, and I apologize, but it's been lovely to be with you all, and I'm so glad to read these. I'll be looking forward to reading these books ahead of mine so that I can learn how to do it right. Kristine, you've totally intimidated me about my biographical chapter, because that's the hardest one for me to write. And now that I've heard that first sentence, I'm stuck. So you're going to have to get me out. Anyway, good luck to you all, and God bless you all. It's great to see you.
Thanks, George. Appreciate your being here. Kristine, I'll just hand that to you, since John had also addressed that to you. To what extent were sort of voices from outside the canon formative on Jean? Of course, Shakespeare being a central focus of his work. How would you handle that question?
Well, Shakespeare was canon to him, as far as I can tell. And actually, I think that's true of everything. And I'm at the disadvantage of not having ever taken a class from England or knowing him personally. And so some of you here will want to correct me on this maybe. But my sense is that he reads everything the same way, in a very sort of, Brigham Young, all truth belongs to Mormonism. He reads everything as though it is a text for to be applied to living an ethical Christian life. And so like Tillich, he quotes a little bit, but I don't have any sense that he made a sort of systematic study of Tillich and compared how this works with Mormon thought. And like William James, there's some very Jamesian notions in England. And I'm sure he read William James, but I think most of that comes through Widtsoe, particularly, who did take a course from James. I think he's just deeply immersed in Mormon thinkers. And so it's almost like, I don't know if this is a good analogy, I may regret this, but I sort of, you know how some very earthy granola mothers like pre-chew their baby's food instead of buying commercially prepared baby food? I feel like England gets bits of American thought, especially early 20th century American thought, sort of pre-chewed from people and incorporates it that way. And he also, I think he has a little bit of a magpie's attraction to beautiful words. And at least I think that because I recognize it in myself, just being sort of captivated by the beauty of words and then backfilling the ideas. And so I think, for instance, like I didn't find him quoting Niebuhr anywhere, except he does take that phrase, the children of light and children of darkness, from an essay of Niebuhr's. And so it's hard to know, Tillich and Niebuhr and those guys were in the zeitgeist. They were quoted in Time magazine. I'm sure that he saw some of their thought, but I don't get the sense of any sort of systematic or deliberate process of assimilating them into Mormon thought. It was more just that he saw everything as Mormon or potentially Mormon. If it was true, it fit into his version of Mormonism.
Thanks. There was another question here from Ben Peters. Thinking about sort of asking you guys to reflect sort of metacritically on the series itself and how your individual volumes fit into it. He asks about sort of structurally, what does it mean that this series on Mormon thought is devised as books on individual thinkers rather than devised topically or historically or something like that. He wonders whether, you know, we might be tempted to fall into a kind of hagiographic mode, although he says he doesn't see that on display here. But what is, Kristine, you gestured toward this just a bit, saying, talking about how there are kind of ecclesiastical impediments to a lay scholar trying to synthesize an arc of Mormon thought, because Mormon thought is so tied up in Mormon theology, and theology is tricky in a church with continuing revelation. And so maybe you suggested the best way to get a handle on Mormon thought is in fact through these sorts of individual studies of Mormon thinkers. But I'd like to hear, Mike, if you'd like to reflect more on that, and then Kristine, what are the potentials and pitfalls of structuring the series around individual figures?
Well, first of all, I do want to assure Ben that there is no hagiography in the Vardis Fisher volume. If anything, I had to resist urges to deeply criticize him. I think that a systematic approach to Mormon theology that incorporated different thinkers, the minute you do that, you're going to draw some people in and you're going to draw some people out. There is no systemized view of Mormon thought that would incorporate Lowell Bennion and Eugene England on one end and Vardis Fisher on the other end. You know, one of them or two of them would have to go if we were going to approach a series that way or approach a volume that way. And part of it is because what a Mormon is not, I mean, that's a contested space, because it's a word that applies to a cultural heritage more now than a particular religious denomination. So I don't really think that an approach to Mormon thought that tried to be systematic and comprehensive could possibly be systematic and comprehensive. It would have to select. That said, when you do individual volumes like this, I think you do run the risk of not having any kind of systemization at all, of just presenting a whole bunch of different people who happen to be Mormon. I know that the series is being modeled on the Oxford Short Introduction series, but have any of you encountered the Yale series called Jewish Lives? I don't know if you have. They have a series called Jewish Lives, and and they've got everybody from Martin Buber to Moses to Albert Einstein, and you get really no systemization of what it really means, because there are just too many people in there, and there is no attempt to pull things back to Jewish thought or even acknowledgement that something would be. I mean, I've read maybe a half a dozen of those volumes, and I can't kind of get to any systemization at all. From what I've seen, the editors are doing a good job of pulling us back when we write about the subjects that we've chosen to something that can be recognizably called Mormon thought. And I think that's going to be important, or else it will just become biographies of people who happen to have something to do with Mormonism, which isn't what the series is supposed to do.
Thanks, Mike. Kristine, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I guess I think it's a good question. I think Mormons are always wanting to resolve that tension between revelation and intellect, one way or the other. Living in the middle of it has always, it's never been a comfortable space. And so I think there could be a temptation to set up, a sort of intellectual hierarchy of people that, count as Mormon thinkers in a way that, maybe general authorities of the church don't. I think the selection process for this series mitigates that to some degree. I mean, there will be some people who were general authorities. There are, I think, Lisa Tate Olson's book on Susie Young Gates is going to be one of the next few that comes out. So it will incorporate women both, from the hierarchy and from without. And I think in seeking, as they have, to include women, they necessarily go outside of the normal categories of sort of academic theologizing or philosophizing in a way, because Amy Brown Lyman clearly had lots of thoughts about Mormonism, but she wasn't a professional thinker in any way. And so I think they will avoid most of the pitfalls that Ben suggests, but that is certainly a way, right? The temptation is always to say, well, I'm an intellectual Mormon, or I'm these are my, this is how I organize my Mormon thought. And the fact that there isn't any really official Mormon thought, despite what people who tell you to keep your conference issue of the ensign next to your scriptures would have you believe, means that we are free to resolve those tensions as we will. I suspect that England in particular would tell us not to resolve them and to live in the paradox.
I agree. Ben Park had a really interesting kind of counterfactual for us to think about here. And so he wonders, can you imagine your subjects, Mike and Kristine, sort of taking the opposite audience, right? Mike, could Vardis Fisher have spoken to a Mormon audience, written for a Mormon audience? If so, what do you think his message might have been? Or if not, what impeded him ever taking that as his audience? And Kristine, conversely, could Gene ever have turned his voice toward non-Mormon audiences? What would his message have been, and why, and why might he have turned in that direction?
That's a really interesting question, and I'm trying to think. Fisher was a controversialist. He didn't like anybody. He didn't like Mormons, but he also didn't like people who criticized Mormons. And he probably, even though the church did not like children of God, he probably got more criticism from secular intellectuals for treating Joseph Smith and Brigham Young with kid gloves than he did criticism from Mormons for portraying Joseph Smith as a polygamist, which at the time was very, very complicated. But so I can imagine Fisher writing to Mormons, but he would probably tell them to grow up and stop idolizing prophets and be good secular intellectuals. But I can also imagine him talking to a group of secular agnostic intellectuals and saying, grow up, stop thinking that you have all the truth simply because you don't believe anything, and using Mormons as an example of people who had a religious belief that motivated them to do some really impressive things. So I think that yes, he would talk to Mormons not nicely, but he would talk nicely about Mormons when talking to non-Mormons not nicely, if that makes sense.
Always the contrarian. I identify with that.
Yeah.
Kristine, any thoughts?
I'm tempted to just say no. I can't imagine that. Everything in sort of the structure as well as the content of England's thinking is in Mormon terms. I guess, from looking at his literary criticism, I could maybe imagine him arguing against post-structuralists and in favor of a sort of reader response theory. And, he does occasionally make forays into that kind of literary criticism and argue for an ethics of reading fiction, which, could get you maybe to Wayne Booth. I think if there were a Eugene England who construed his audience as non-Mormon, maybe it would be, Wayne Booth and the ethics of fiction. That seems like the closest I could imagine, but you'd lose everything about him that's wonderful. So I don't know if I can't imagine wanting that.
I encourage everybody to read in the chat. We won't be able to get to every question tonight. We just have a few more minutes. But there are some very interesting questions and thoughts and comments over there. Matt, because there does seem to be a lot of interest in this question about how this series itself conceives of Mormon thought, Matt Bowman offered to talk about that a little bit. Jonathan, can we unmute Matt?
I am unmuted.
Great, go ahead.
Great, yeah, and I appreciate all of the interest the series is getting, and I'm delighted and grateful to MSH for putting this on. The initial conception that Joe and I had for the series, and in fact, one of the initial titles for it that we were kicking around was Introductions to the Mormon Imagination. Which is to say, what we were interested in, the central question we were interested in, is how these people imagined what Mormonism was, and the different visions and ways of structuring Mormonism that you see from these different thinkers. So in that sense, we're using that word thinker and thought kind of broadly, and that might actually speak to some of the next volumes that will be coming out. It is, I think, somewhat a coincidence, and perhaps an unhappy coincidence, that the first 3 volumes that our authors finished are all on, mid 20th century men. The next 3 volumes, my guess, and I cannot say this for certain, but my guess would be the next 3 volumes that will come out are going to be on Sonia Johnson, Minerva Teichert, and J. Reuben Clark. And that gives you a sense for some of the breadth that we are pursuing here. And really, I think, what has been said about the lack of systematization of what Mormon thought is or should be is certainly embedded here. We are not attempting to be really prescriptive in any sense, and nor are we, I think, attempting to be all-encompassing or systematic. Rather, we're interested in diversity and really in, I think, plurality and a capacious notion of what Mormonism is and what Mormon thought is. There is also a volume on Joseph Musser, who is one of the leading FLDS theologians in the works, as well as a volume on Joseph Smith III, which will give you a sense, I think, for how big this tent ultimately is. So I'll wrap up there.
Thanks. That's really helpful, Matt. I'm looking through here. We really only have another moment. So I think probably we won't tackle any of these other questions. Jonathan has said that he has saved all these questions, and we perhaps in some other way we can ask our speakers tonight to respond to them. So I want to thank Kristine and Mike again. Thank you to George, who's had to leave us. We're so excited to read your books. We're grateful for the work that you've done. I think we can see its value. Thank you to Matt and Joseph for their leadership of the series as well. Yeah, may the counterfactuals and conversations and sermons and broadsides continue. So thanks everybody for being with us tonight.
Thank you, Rosalynde. We'll put out some information soon about the next in this series. I appreciate your patience tonight as we've worked out the bugs. We'll have our own Zoom account as MSH for the next one, and a lot more control about how and when and to whom this invitation goes. So hopefully we'll be Zoom bomb free at the next occasion, but appreciate the tips and help in getting control of that early in the meeting. Just quickly, I did manage to record starting from chapter 2 of George's book. I realized at that point that I hadn't actually been recording. Middle age is not pleasant. So those of you that are not there yet, just don't bother with it. It's not worth your time. Thanks again, everyone, Rosalynde, and to our panelists for moving on this very, very quickly, mobilizing and coming together for this discussion, and to you all for the great questions. We'll see you next time.